AITA for getting my coworker fired after she kept trying to prove my service dog is fake. Starting a new job always comes with a mix of excitement and nerves. But for me, there was an added layer. I have a heart condition that sometimes causes me to pass out with little warning. Thankfully, I have Max, my medical alert service dog, who's trained to sense when my heart rate shifts dangerously. Max is more than a companion, he's my lifeline. He can detect changes in my body long before I do, giving me time to sit or signal for help before an episode hits. He's saved me countless times, and with him by my side, I feel like I can live a somewhat normal life. 3 months ago, I started a new job in an office that seemed welcoming and flexible. During the interview process, I explained my condition and Max's role. The company seemed supportive, and I was hopeful that I'd finally found a place where I could focus on my work without constantly needing to justify Max's presence. For the first few weeks, everything went smoothly. My coworkers were curious, as people often are, but they were kind and respectful. Most of them quickly learned that Max isn't a pet, he's here for a purpose. Then came Karen. Karen wasn't in my department, so I didn't interact with her much at first. But every now and then, she'd make little comments about Max. The first time she saw him, she wrinkled her nose and muttered something like, "I thought pets weren't allowed in the office." I brushed it off as a simple misunderstanding. I explained to her that Max is a service dog, highly trained and certified, with official documentation to prove it. Karen nodded but seemed unconvinced, like she was filing the information away with some judgment she wasn't quite ready to share. At first, her skepticism seemed minor, almost laughable. I'd encountered people who questioned Max's role before, usually strangers in stores or on the street, so it wasn't new. Most people, once they understand the reason for Max's presence, respect the situation. I figured Karen would be the same, that she'd eventually let it go once she saw how important Max was to my well-being. I tried to stay positive, reminding myself that not everyone understands invisible disabilities or the critical work service dogs do. But over the next few days, I noticed a pattern forming. Whenever I passed Karen in the hall or the break room, she'd make some pointed comment, like, "Rules are rules," or, "It's odd to see a dog in the office." It was subtle, but there was an edge to her tone that left me feeling uncomfortable. She wasn't openly hostile, but it was clear she had her doubts. And each time, I'd politely explain again that Max is a service dog, hoping that would be the end of it. Unfortunately, it was only the beginning. At first, Karen's skepticism was annoying, but I could ignore it. A passing comment here, a raised eyebrow there, nothing that felt truly invasive. But gradually, her behavior started to shift from skepticism to something more deliberate, almost calculated. I could sense her testing boundaries, trying to catch me in what she must have thought was some kind of lie. One day, as I was grabbing coffee in the break room, Karen sidled up next to me with a smirk. "You know, pets really don't belong in offices," she said, giving Max a disdainful glance. I calmly reminded her that Max is a trained service dog and that his presence was cleared by our. She waved a hand dismissively. "Well, I think it's a little too convenient. You seem perfectly healthy to me," she added, her voice dripping with skepticism. I felt a pang of irritation but bit it back, trying to keep things civil. "I'd rather be healthy too," I replied quietly, hoping she'd take the hint and back off. But instead of backing off, Karen seemed to double down. The very next day, she began a series of subtle tests to try and expose Max, as if she were on some mission to prove he wasn't really a service dog. It started with little things. She'd drop bits of food near him to see if he'd break his focus and go for it. Max, ever the professional, ignored the bait each time, his attention unwavering. But Karen seemed unfazed, as if she was determined to catch him slipping. I could feel my patience wearing thin. Her attempts didn't stop there. She began, accidentally, bumping into us in the hallway, loudly remarking how odd it was that I needed a service dog at my age. "You're too young to be disabled," she'd say, just loud enough for others to hear, trying to paint me as someone who was faking or exaggerating my condition. I could sense some of my colleagues' curiosity shifting. A few subtle glances thrown my way, and I felt a familiar frustration bubbling up. Max stayed calm through it all, unflinching and focused, his eyes trained on me, ready to alert at a moment's notice. He was, in many ways, my source of strength, keeping me grounded despite Karen's increasingly bold provocations. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that people like Karen would never understand what it's like to live with an invisible disability. Still, her constant jabs and her attempts to prove Max was a pet began to weigh on me, affecting my sense of safety in the office. I even considered reporting her behavior to our, but I hesitated, hoping that Karen's interest would eventually wane. I didn't want to be seen as overly sensitive or dramatic, especially since I was still relatively new. But as Karen's behavior escalated, it became clear that this wasn't just idle curiosity, it was a full-blown campaign of doubt and harassment. Karen's antics weren't just an annoyance anymore, they were turning the office into a hostile environment. It wasn't long before she upped her efforts from sneaky tests of Max's training to outright harassment. Every time I walked in, it felt like her eyes were on me, waiting to pounce on some mistake or perceived inconsistency. I tried to ignore her, but it was like trying to ignore a thorn that kept digging deeper. Day after day. Then, she began filing complaints to our, and that's when things took a serious turn. Every week, I'd hear from my manager or an HR representative that Karen had raised concerns about Max's presence. The first time, our called me in to ask if I could provide Max's certification and explain his role in managing my condition. I went in, document in hand, and walked them through the necessary training Max had undergone. HR was understanding, and they reassured me that everything was above board. But Karen wouldn't let it go. Her complaints became a regular event, each one focusing on a different aspect. One week, she claimed Max was a distraction to her and others. Another week, she questioned whether a service dog was truly necessary, suggesting I was exaggerating my health condition. HR continued to support me, brushing aside her complaints after confirming Max's role. But each new complaint wore on me, eroding the peace I'd felt when I started the job. It was like being in a constant state of defense, always having to prove that I belonged. It didn't help that Karen's whispers had started to reach other ears in the office. I began to notice certain coworkers giving me sideways glances, especially after one of Karen's complaints would circulate. I could sense the doubt spreading, a subtle shift in the way people interacted with me. Some colleagues who used to greet me warmly in the break room now seemed hesitant, their friendliness dimmed by Karen's constant accusations. Even if most people were polite, I could feel the change, a quiet, uncomfortable distance growing between us. Things took a particularly troubling turn when Karen began using scent as a weapon. Knowing that strong smells can trigger my condition, she'd wear intense perfume or spray air fresheners around my desk, claiming it was part of freshening up the office. One day, the smell was so overpowering that Max had to alert me 3 times within a few hours. Each alert left me feeling weaker and more vulnerable. Max's quiet insistence a constant reminder of how fragile my safety had become in what should have been a supportive environment. That day marked a shift for me. I started to feel afraid, not just frustrated, but genuinely concerned that Karen's actions were putting my health in jeopardy. It was clear she wasn't just trying to prove Max wasn't a real service dog. She was actively attempting to push me to a breaking point, using every tool at her disposal to make me uncomfortable, if not outright unsafe. As much as I tried to reason with myself, telling myself she would eventually get tired or move on, I could no longer ignore that this situation was spiraling beyond my control. The atmosphere had become tense, hostile even, and Max could sense my anxiety. He stayed close, never leaving my side, his calm presence a small comfort amid the storm. But I was beginning to realize that if Karen's behavior didn't stop, I'd have to make a choice: endure this daily harassment and the constant risk to my health, or take a stand and protect myself. One afternoon, a colleague, a quiet but kind coworker named Rachel, approached me cautiously in the break room. She seemed uncomfortable, shifting her weight as if debating whether to say something. Finally, she handed me her phone, open to a Facebook post. "I thought you should see this," she said, her voice soft but resolute. I felt my stomach drop as I looked at the screen. There, in a public Facebook group dedicated to exposing fake service dogs, was a picture of Max and me, taken without my knowledge. Karen had posted it, using my full name and our workplace, asking the group if anyone had tips for outing fake service dogs. She even wrote a detailed post accusing me of faking my condition, painting me as some sort of fraud. In an instant, my private medical needs and workplace were blasted into a space where strangers could openly dissect and judge. Reading her post felt like an invasion I hadn't anticipated. I'd braced myself for her questioning, her constant tests. But this was different. Now it wasn't just Karen questioning my legitimacy, she was opening me up to ridicule, exposing my life to strangers who knew nothing about my condition or my struggle. I felt a strange, cold fear settle into my bones. I hadn't signed up for public scrutiny, hadn't agreed to have my health and my needs dissected by a faceless group of people online. And the fact that Karen, someone I worked alongside every day, had gone to such lengths felt deeply personal and unthinkably cruel. As the reality of the post sank in, so did the fear of what this exposure could mean. Anyone could now see where I worked and decide to comment, harass, or even confront me. My medical needs were no longer private, no longer safe within the boundaries of my office. I worried about who might see the post, about what strangers might feel justified in saying or doing now that Karen had essentially invited them into my life without my consent. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. I tried to focus on Max, his calm presence next to me, the way he sat close, offering his silent support as he always did. But my mind raced with anxiety, replaying the image of that post, the flood of comments calling me a liar, the fear of being seen as a fraud by people who knew nothing of my life or the daily challenges I faced. Beyond the anger and fear, though, was a creeping sense of self-doubt. I'd spent years managing my condition, building the confidence to advocate for myself and for Max's role in my life. But Karen's actions had brought back old insecurities. The painful feeling of being misunderstood, of needing to justify my existence and my needs to people who simply refused to see me as valid. The weight of her judgment, and now the judgment of strangers, was suffocating. Part of me wanted to confront her directly, to demand an answer as to why she would do something so invasive, so malicious. But I knew it would only add fuel to the fire. I'd already seen how far she was willing to go to prove me wrong. And I had no interest in giving her more ammunition. Instead, I took screenshots of her posts and comments, capturing every instance where she'd exposed me and twisted my story for her own satisfaction. It was time to take this to hour. The day after discovering Karen's online post, I felt raw, exhausted, and uneasy at work. I kept my head down, avoiding eye contact as I passed Karen in the hall. She looked pleased with herself, her smirk barely hidden as she glanced my way. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I would address this in the safest way possible, through hour. But Karen wasn't finished. Around midday, a heavy, pungent wave of perfume drifted over to my desk. It was suffocating, strong enough to make my head spin. My heart rate quickened, and before I knew it, Max was nudging my leg with his nose, his signal for me to sit or find support. I'd experienced this before, the lightheadedness, the way my vision blurred at the edges. Max knew it, too, his eyes steady and trained on me, his alert more insistent. I steadied myself, breathing slowly as I tried to clear my head. But Karen didn't stop. After spraying the perfume near my desk, she made her way back to her own, shooting me a smug look as she passed. I realized she was doing it on purpose. She was trying to provoke a reaction, to push me to the point of breakdown as some twisted proof that I didn't belong here. That Max didn't belong here. Later that afternoon, I found her back at it, spraying an air freshener in the common area near my desk. The scent was nauseatingly strong. And within minutes, Max was alerting again. I felt trapped, the smell clinging to my clothes, my workspace, making it impossible to focus or breathe easily. Max's repeated alerts made me realize that Karen's testing had crossed into something far more dangerous. Her actions weren't just harassment, they were putting my health at serious risk. Feeling lightheaded and shaken, I took a deep breath and finally allowed myself to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. This was no longer something I could brush aside or hope would resolve on its own. I'd tried to be patient, tried to handle things without escalation. But Karen's behavior was endangering my health and undermining my basic right to feel safe at work. I gathered my evidence, the screenshots of her online posts, messages from supportive coworkers who had witnessed her behavior, and even a few notes I'd written down about her, testing Max with dropped food and perfume. Then, with Max by my side, I walked to my determination solidifying with each step. I'd put up with enough. And now it was time to stand up for myself, for Max, and for every person who'd ever been forced to justify their needs to someone who refused to listen. When I arrived, HR listened quietly as I laid everything out. I showed them the screenshots of her social media posts, the comments she'd made in the office, and explained how the overwhelming scents she'd sprayed around my desk had triggered my condition multiple times. I could see the concern on their faces as they took it all in. Realizing the extent of Karen's harassment, they assured me they would handle it swiftly, and I left their office feeling both anxious and relieved, unsure of what would happen next but certain I'd done the right thing. By the next morning, Karen was gone. HR had acted quickly, terminating her for harassment and creating a hostile work environment. As much as I felt relief, knowing that my workplace was finally a safe space again, there was also a strange emptiness. I didn't enjoy seeing anyone lose their job, even Karen, but her actions had left me no choice. She'd crossed boundaries that weren't hers to test, invading my privacy, compromising my health, and threatening my dignity. The decision had been hers to act maliciously, and now she was facing the consequences. While I felt a small pang of guilt, I knew that Karen had been given ample opportunity to respect my boundaries. Instead, she had chosen to violate them repeatedly, forcing me to take this final step to protect myself and Max. The initial relief I felt after Karen's termination was short-lived. Only a day later, my inbox and social media accounts were flooded with messages from unfamiliar names, friends and family of Karen, accusing me of ruining her life and being heartless. They called me selfish, said I'd destroyed the livelihood of a mother of 3, over just a dog, and told me I should have just worked from home if my condition was that serious. Reading through these messages felt surreal. I knew what Karen had done was unacceptable. I had the evidence and the scars of anxiety to prove it. Yet here I was, facing a torrent of blame for actions I hadn't initiated, for boundaries she had repeatedly broken. Each message chipped away at the sense of closure I'd hoped to feel. While I knew I'd done the right thing for my health and safety, the words stung, planting seeds of doubt that I struggled to shake. The accusations made me question myself, even though I knew deep down that Karen had crossed multiple lines. Did I handle things the wrong way? Could I have somehow de-escalated things without involving HR? The guilt swirled inside me, combining with the frustration of not being understood. They seemed to see me as the villain in Karen's story, ignoring the fact that she'd gone so far as to jeopardize my health and dox me online. Each message brought back a familiar ache of self-doubt. Living with an invisible disability meant constantly battling the feeling of needing to prove myself, to justify my limitations to those who couldn't see them. Karen's friends and family didn't know me or my struggles. They didn't understand that Max was a necessity, not an indulgence. To them, it was simply about a lost job and a lost paycheck, not the violations and disrespect I'd endured. In an attempt to regain some perspective, I reached out to a few supportive friends and colleagues who knew about the situation. I needed reassurance, a reminder of why I'd been pushed to take such action. Their words were a balm to my frayed nerves, grounding me in the reality of Karen's behavior. They reminded me that Karen had harassed me for weeks, tried to expose me, and put my safety at risk. None of this was my fault. They assured me Karen's choices had led to her termination, not my request for a safe work environment. Gradually, I started to believe them. The endless messages from Karen's supporters continued to trickle in, but I found that their words held less weight as I reminded myself of the truth. Karen had created a hostile and unsafe environment, and I had every right to stand up for myself. I didn't deserve the harassment or the guilt that had been thrust upon me. I reminded myself that while I felt sympathy for her children, it wasn't my responsibility to shield her from the consequences of her actions. My only responsibility was to ensure my well-being and create a safe environment for myself. Max remained my constant companion through this difficult period. His steady presence a reminder of the life and stability I'd fought to protect. Through his calm, I found my own, realizing that I could handle the backlash and move forward. The messages from Karen's supporters eventually faded, but the experience left a lasting impact, a bittersweet reminder of the importance of standing firm. Even when doing so comes with its own set of burdens. In the quiet that followed Karen's departure, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. Her harassment hadn't just been about Max or her strange vendetta against service dogs. It had dug deeper, forcing me to confront a harsh truth: society's unrelenting skepticism toward invisible disabilities. I'd spent years trying to live openly with my condition, but Karen's actions had shined a glaring light on the ways ableism still existed in everyday spaces. Even in a professional setting where I'd expected understanding and acceptance. From the beginning, Karen hadn't just doubted Max's presence, she doubted me. Her assumptions about who deserves to use a service dog or who looks disabled enough were rooted in an ignorance I knew existed but had rarely faced so directly. The subtle comments she'd made about my age or my appearance, the way she'd tried to test Max's training, all pointed to a rigid mindset that couldn't see past the surface. To her, disability had to look a certain way, present a certain way, and if it didn't fit her narrow view, it was worthy of suspicion. The reality of invisible disabilities is a strange paradox. People think they know what disability looks like, and if you don't match that picture, they start to question your needs, assuming you're exaggerating or faking. It's exhausting, this constant pressure to prove oneself, to justify needs that are as real as any visible injury or condition. Karen's behavior was extreme, yes, but her mindset wasn't unique. I'd encountered it in subtler forms over the years, in side eyes from strangers, in dismissive comments from acquaintances, even in the skeptical looks from new doctors who'd read my file. Living with an invisible condition is more than managing symptoms, it's managing other people's perceptions, too. And with that comes a burden that others don't see, a layer of stress that sits quietly on top of the condition itself. My service dog Max was a part of my life not because I wanted attention or pity but because he was literally life-saving. Yet Karen couldn't, or wouldn't, see that. She reduced him to a pet, a prop in some elaborate lie she'd invented in her head. Reflecting on these things, I felt a strange blend of sadness and resolve. Sadness that people like Karen, with their small-mindedness and prejudice, could make something as essential as a service dog feel like an inconvenience to justify. But I also felt a renewed sense of strength. For all the discomfort and danger Karen had caused, she'd reminded me why it was so important to advocate for myself and to stand firm against those who would diminish my needs. I understood now that people like Karen weren't just frustrating, they were a threat to the safety and dignity of those who live with disabilities. Her behavior wasn't simply annoying, it was emblematic of a larger issue. The societal insistence that people with disabilities prove their worth and justify their existence in spaces where they had every right to be. Through this ordeal, I found a renewed commitment to advocacy, not just for myself, but for others who faced the same prejudice and doubt. I decided to share my story more openly, hoping it might help someone else who struggled with the same fears and frustrations. I wanted others to know that they weren't alone in facing these battles and that their needs were valid, no matter who questioned them. Karen had forced me to take a stand, and in doing so, she'd given me a sense of empowerment I hadn't felt before. Yes, there was still anger, but there was also a clarity, a new awareness of my strength and my rights. I didn't owe anyone an explanation or proof for simply existing with my disability and for needing Max by my side. In the weeks following Karen's firing, I felt a shift in how I approached the world and my own experiences. I no longer saw Max's presence as something to be explained or defended but as something as fundamental as breathing. I realized that people would always question, always doubt what they couldn't see or understand. But their doubts were theirs to own, not mine to internalize. And as I moved forward, I held onto that clarity, that sense of self-worth, determined to protect my peace and my safety, no matter who chose not to understand. After Karen's departure and the turmoil of the messages from her friends and family faded, I found myself in an unfamiliar space, a quieter, calmer workplace. I no longer felt the prickling anxiety that used to accompany walking into the office each day, wondering what new challenge or comment would await me. Instead, I felt an ease settle over me, a sense of reclaiming my own space and focus. It was as if a fog had lifted, allowing me to truly settle into my job and daily routine without the constant need to defend or explain myself. At work, things were different in subtle ways. Two coworkers who had once seemed distant began to warm up again. I think some of them realized, perhaps in retrospect, the severity of what I'd endured. A few even offered small apologies for not stepping in or expressing their support earlier. I didn't blame them. Ableism, especially in its more subtle forms, is often so ingrained that people overlook or dismiss it without realizing the harm it causes. Their gestures, however simple, helped to ease any residual tension and reminded me that I wasn't as alone in this journey as I'd sometimes felt. Max, ever my calm and dependable companion, became even more attuned to my needs in the wake of all we'd been through. He seemed to sense my newfound confidence, responding to my energy with an even deeper sense of loyalty. I felt grateful every day for his presence. Max wasn't just a service dog, he was a lifeline. A silent but powerful support that had seen me through one of the toughest times of my life. His calm steadiness reminded me that I could handle whatever came next. And our bond grew stronger as I recognized the role he'd played, not just in alerting me to medical issues, but in reminding me of my own resilience. Outside of work, I began to take deliberate steps toward healing and self-care. After months of dealing with Karen's harassment and the intense scrutiny of people who doubted my needs, I felt the need to nurture my mental well-being. I took up journaling again, finding solace in putting my thoughts on paper, processing the residual anger and frustration in a way that felt safe and cathartic. In those pages, I rediscovered a quiet strength within myself, a sense of determination that, no matter what challenges came, I could face them with resilience. My experience with Karen had also shown me the importance of boundaries, not just in the workplace but in every aspect of my life. I began to understand that setting boundaries wasn't just about protecting myself from others but about respecting my own needs and well-being. I'd once thought that accommodating others, even at my own expense, was the path of least resistance. But I now realized that doing so only left me more vulnerable to harm. Going forward, I made a commitment to listen to my instincts and stand firm in protecting my needs. This period of healing and reflection also inspired me to connect with others who might be going through similar experiences. I reached out to a local support group for individuals with disabilities, wanting to share my story in the hope that it might offer someone else the same strength and validation that I had sought. The group became a safe space where I could share not only my struggles but also the small victories that came with self-advocacy. Knowing that others faced the same doubts, fears, and misunderstandings made me feel both grounded and empowered. As the months passed, I found myself looking to the future with a new sense of optimism. The experience with Karen had been painful and exhausting, but it had also revealed my resilience and my capacity to stand up for myself. Even when others doubted me, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the support I'd received from friends, colleagues, and even strangers who understood the importance of respecting the needs of people like me. With Max by my side, I returned to the routines and goals I'd set aside, ready to embrace new challenges without fear. I knew now that I had the strength to navigate adversity, that I didn't need to apologize for my needs or justify my existence. And though I couldn't change the doubts and judgments others might hold, I could choose to prioritize my health and happiness, to build a life that honored both myself and the role that Max played in it. In the end, I realized that healing wasn't just about moving on, it was about moving forward with a renewed sense of purpose and self-worth. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free to be myself, unapologetically, knowing that I had the strength to protect the life I had fought so hard to build. As I continued to settle into the routine of life after Karen, I found myself looking back on everything with a clarity that only time and distance could provide. This experience had tested me in ways I hadn't anticipated, pushing me to confront not just Karen's overt hostility but also the quieter, ingrained ableism that existed around me and even, at times, within myself. I'd learned more than I ever expected about the importance of boundaries, the necessity of self-advocacy, and the courage it takes to stand up for one's own needs, especially when others doubt or dismiss them. One of the biggest lessons I took away was the importance of trusting my instincts. Throughout Karen's harassment, there had been moments where I doubted myself, wondering if I was somehow in the wrong for expecting to be treated with respect. I'd questioned my own needs, as if accommodating her discomfort should somehow take precedence over my own safety. But each time, I was reminded by Max, by my true friends, and by my own body that those needs were not only valid but essential. Looking back, I was proud of the moments I'd held firm, refusing to let others dictate my worth or the legitimacy of my experiences. Another lesson was the power of community and support. For so long, I'd tried to handle everything on my own, afraid that speaking up would make me appear weak or needy. But when I finally reached out to others, friends, coworkers, support groups, I realized that strength doesn't come from enduring alone. It comes from knowing when to seek help and allowing others to lift us when we're struggling. The kindness and validation I received helped me heal and rebuild my confidence, reminding me that there are people who understand, who respect my journey, and who stand beside me. Through this experience, I also came to understand that standing up for myself wasn't an act of selfishness, it was an act of self-respect. By setting boundaries, I wasn't pushing others away, I was protecting the space I needed to live a healthy, fulfilling life. For the first time, I could see that advocating for myself wasn't something I should ever feel guilty about. It was a necessary part of honoring my worth and recognizing the life I deserved. In many ways, Karen's harassment had forced me to confront parts of myself that I hadn't realized were so deeply wounded. I saw now that I'd been carrying the weight of society's expectations for years, trying to blend in, to appear normal, to downplay Max's role to avoid making others uncomfortable. But through this trial, I discovered a new sense of pride in my reality. Max wasn't something to hide or explain away, he was a symbol of my resilience, a constant reminder that I was worthy of safety and support. With these lessons in mind, I felt a renewed strength to face whatever lay ahead. I knew there would always be people who questioned or misunderstood my needs. But I was no longer afraid of their opinions. I'd found my voice, and I was ready to use it, not just for myself but for others who might feel pressured to shrink or hide their experiences. In the end, I understood that my worth was not up for debate. I had fought hard to build a life that honored my needs and valued my well-being. And I wasn't about to let anyone take that away. This journey had taught me that my health, my safety, and my peace were non-negotiable. And I was prepared to protect them fiercely, no matter what challenges came my way. With Max by my side, I was ready to move forward, stronger and more certain than ever. I knew that I would continue to face misunderstandings and obstacles, but I also knew I had the resilience and the clarity to handle them. This was my life, my journey, and for the first time, I felt truly empowered to live it unapologetically, knowing that I had both the right and the strength to prioritize my well-being.